This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. The morning mist clung to the hollows of Newton County, Arkansas, like it had every morning for as long as anyone could remember. But on September 14, 1962, something was different. The Vahanian family, who had lived in their isolated homestead 12 miles southeast of Jasper for over 3 decades, was no longer pretending. According to county records housed in the Arkansas State Archives, the Vahanian property was purchased in 1929 by Casimir Vahanian, described in the deed as a merchant of indeterminate origin. The transaction, recorded on March 15th of that year, involved the acquisition of 280 acres of heavily wooded land, accessible only by a logging road that meandered through dense pine and oak forests. The price paid was unusually high for such remote property during the Depression era, leading some local officials to question the source of Vahanian's funds. The family consisted of Casimir, his wife Marceline, and 2 other adult relatives, Aurelius and Cordelia. Neighbors were few and far between in that part of Newton County. The closest homestead belonged to the Grady's, a farming family located approximately 4 miles northeast, who rarely had occasion to interact with the Vahanians except for occasional glimpses during monthly trips to Jasper for supplies. Mrs. Estelle Grady, interviewed by county historian Dalton Reeves in 1965, described the Vahanians as peculiar but harmless folk. She recalled seeing them in town perhaps 8 or 10 times per year, always together, always silent, except when conducting necessary business. They dressed in outdated clothes, she noted, like they'd stepped out of 1910 and never bothered to catch up. Casimir wore the same black wool coat winter and summer, and Marceline never showed her hair beneath that dark bonnet. The 2 young ones looked like they were carved from the same stone as their parents, if you understand my meaning. What made the Grady account particularly significant was her description of the family's purchasing patterns. They bought odd things, she recalled, enormous quantities of salt, far more lamp oil than you'd need for a house that size. And they always paid in silver coins, never paper money. Casimir would lay those coins out on the counter, one by one, like he was performing some kind of ceremony. The storekeeper at Turner's General Mercantile, a man named Horace Bledsoe, kept detailed ledgers of all transactions during the 1930s and 1940s. These ledgers, discovered during the building's demolition in 1963, revealed that the Vahanians' purchases followed a strict pattern. Every 3rd Friday of each month, they would arrive precisely at 2:15 p.m. and purchase the same items: 20 pounds of rock salt, 10 gallons of lamp oil, large quantities of preserved meats, dried beans, cornmeal, and a curious item listed in Bledsoe's shorthand as speck candles, black. Bledsoe's son, Morton, who occasionally helped in the store during the 1940s, provided additional details when interviewed by the county clerk in 1962. Father always said there was something not right about their money, Morton recalled. Some of those silver coins looked old, older than anything you'd see in regular circulation, and they had markings on them I'd never seen before. Foreign, maybe, but not like any European country I knew of. The Vahanian homestead itself was a substantial structure for such a remote location. Built from local stone and timber, the house stood 2 stories tall with a steeply pitched roof and unusually small windows. The property included several outbuildings, a large barn, a smokehouse, and what appeared to be a root cellar built into the side of a small hill approximately 50 yards behind the main house. Aerial photographs taken by the Soil Conservation Service in 1954 as part of a regional erosion survey show the Vahanian property in clear detail. The images reveal something unusual about the layout of the buildings. While most homesteads of that era were oriented to take advantage of prevailing winds and natural drainage, the Vahanian structures were arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate geometric pattern. The main house, barn, and outbuildings formed the points of a precise triangle, with the root cellar positioned at the exact center. Forest Ranger Timothy Ashworth, whose territory included the remote areas around the Vahanian property, noted several peculiarities about the family's land use in his monthly reports filed with the Arkansas Forestry Commission. Hunting was strictly prohibited on their property, he wrote in a report dated November 1958. Posted signs were numerous and explicit. More unusual was the condition of the wildlife in the area. Game trails that should have crossed their property seemed to circle around it instead. In 20 years of working these woods, I've never seen deer avoid an area so completely unless there was some specific threat they could sense. Ashworth's reports also mentioned his observations during his periodic fire prevention inspections. The family maintained fire breaks around their structures that were far more extensive than necessary, he noted. But what struck me as odd was the way they'd cleared the undergrowth in certain areas. It wasn't random clearing for practical purposes. There were specific patterns, almost like pathways, but pathways that didn't lead anywhere visible from the property boundaries. The two adult relatives, Aurelius and Cordelia, were seldom seen in town. Records from the Newton County Department of Education show no enrollment for either individual, though private education was not uncommon in that rural area during the 1930s and 1940s. When they did accompany their parents to Jasper, townspeople remembered them as unusually quiet and well-behaved, but with mannerisms that seemed strange for their apparent ages. Dr. Harlan Fitzgerald, the county's only physician from 1935 to 1961, kept detailed notes on all patients he treated. His records, donated to the County Historical Society after his death, show only one entry for the Vahanian family. In July 1943, Marceline Vahanian sought treatment for what Dr. Fitzgerald described as severe burns on both hands, consistent with prolonged contact with heated metal. His notes indicate that she was reluctant to explain how the injuries occurred, stating only that it was an accident during preservation work. More intriguing was Dr. Fitzgerald's observation about Marceline's physical condition. Patient appears significantly older than stated age of 42, he wrote. Extensive premature graying, deeply lined skin, and gait suggesting advanced arthritis. When questioned about family medical history, patient became agitated and terminated consultation abruptly. Of note, patient's palms showed unusual scarring patterns that appeared deliberate rather than accidental. The first concrete indication that something was seriously wrong at the Vahanian homestead came in August 1962 when county tax assessor William Moss attempted to conduct his annual property evaluation. Moss, who had performed similar assessments for over a decade, found the family's behavior markedly different from previous years. They had always been standoffish, Moss reported to County Clerk Raymond Tate, but this time was different. Casimir met me at the property line and refused to allow me beyond the front gate. He kept saying the assessment could be conducted from there, that nothing had changed since the previous year. But I could see smoke coming from behind the house, like they were burning something, and the smell. Moss paused in his report, then continued, "It wasn't wood smoke. It was something else, something I can't properly describe." Moss also noted that the family members he could see appeared to be in poor health. Aurelius looked like he'd lost considerable weight since I'd seen him in the spring, and Cordelia kept her distance. But even from far away, I could tell something was wrong, the way she moved, like she was injured or sick. The tax assessment incident prompted County Clerk Tate to make inquiries with other officials who had reason to visit the Vahanian property. Mail carrier Rufus Henderson, who delivered to the remote homestead twice monthly, reported that for the past several months the family had been meeting him at the main road rather than allowing him to approach the house, as had been their custom for decades. They acted like they were protecting something, Henderson told Tate, and they kept looking back toward the house while we talked, like they were worried about leaving it alone too long. Mail that used to be collected from the house was now handed to me already prepared, like they'd been waiting for days. Henderson also mentioned an unusual detail about the family's mail. They'd been receiving more correspondence than usual, he noted, official-looking letters, some from government offices I couldn't identify. And there was one particular sender whose letters came monthly, always marked personal and confidential. The return address was just initials, KM, with a post office box in Little Rock. The situation escalated on September 14, 1962, when a county road crew working on bridge repairs approximately 2 miles from the Bahanian property reported seeing thick black smoke rising from the direction of their homestead. Crew foreman Dale McInnes initially assumed it was a controlled burn of agricultural waste, common for that time of year. But the smoke kept coming all day, McInnes reported, and it wasn't the right color for burning brush or trash. It was dark, oily-looking smoke, and the wind kept shifting it our direction. The smell was... McInnes struggled to find words. It was like burning rubber, but worse, made some of my men sick to their stomachs. By evening, when the smoke had not diminished, McInnes decided to investigate. He drove his truck down the logging road toward the Bahanian property, accompanied by 2 crew members, Pete Harrelson and Jim Cordell. What they found when they reached the property line would later be described in an official incident report filed with the Newton County Sheriff's Department. The front gate, usually kept closed but not locked, was standing wide open. The main house appeared undamaged from the road, but the smoke was clearly coming from behind the structure in the area where the outbuildings were located. McInnes called out several times but received no response. After waiting approximately 15 minutes, the 3 men decided to investigate further. As they approached the house on foot, they could see that the smoke was coming from the root cellar area. The wooden door that covered the entrance to the underground structure had been removed, and flames were visible rising from within. More disturbing was the complete absence of any family members. No vehicles were visible, and the house itself appeared to be empty. Harrelson, who had some experience with volunteer firefighting, attempted to assess whether the fire posed a threat to the other buildings. As he approached the root cellar entrance, he made a discovery that prompted the men to immediately retreat and contact authorities. There were personal belongings scattered around the cellar entrance, Harrelson later testified. Clothes, household items, things that looked like they'd been thrown out in a hurry. But what scared us was that some of the clothes looked like they'd been cut off someone, like they'd been removed from people who couldn't undress themselves. The men also reported finding what appeared to be documents burning in the fire. Cordell attempted to retrieve some of the papers, but they were too damaged by flames and smoke to be readable. They looked like official papers, he noted. Government forms, maybe, or legal documents, but somebody definitely wanted them destroyed. Sheriff Vernon Hayes responded to the scene approximately 45 minutes after McInnes's initial call. His official report, filed on September 15, 1962, documented a scene that defied easy explanation. The fire in the root cellar appeared to have been deliberately set, using what Hayes described as an accelerant of some kind, possibly kerosene or lamp oil. The contents of the underground space had been almost completely destroyed, leaving only ash, twisted metal, and fragments of unidentifiable materials. More puzzling was the condition of the main house. A thorough search revealed that the structure had been systematically emptied. Furniture remained in place, but all personal belongings, documents, photographs, and clothing had been removed. The kitchen cabinets were empty, as were all drawers and storage areas. Even items that would normally be considered too valueless to bother with, such as old newspapers and household linens, were gone. Sheriff Hayes noted several peculiarities about the house itself that suggested the family had been preparing for their departure for some time. Windows had been nailed shut from the inside, his report states, not boarded up from the outside, like you'd do to protect an empty house, but nailed from inside, like someone didn't want anything getting out. Hayes also discovered that all mirrors in the house had been removed and that every room showed evidence of recent thorough cleaning with strong chemical solutions. In the basement of the main house, Hayes found something that would later prove crucial to understanding the Vahanian family's circumstances. Built into one wall was a hidden compartment, approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, that appeared to have been used for storage. The space was empty except for metal brackets mounted on the walls and floors that showed signs of having supported heavy objects. Whatever had been stored in that compartment was substantial, Hayes observed. The brackets were heavy-duty, like what you'd use for machinery or large containers, and there were marks on the floor indicating that heavy items had been dragged in and out repeatedly over a long period of time. More disturbing were stains on the floor of the hidden compartment that appeared to be biological in nature. Hayes collected samples for analysis, but the county lacked facilities for sophisticated testing. The samples were sent to the State Crime Laboratory in Little Rock, but the results, if any were obtained, were never made public. The search for the Vahanian family extended throughout Newton County and into surrounding areas. Sheriff Hayes coordinated with law enforcement agencies in adjacent counties, but no trace of the family or their vehicle was found. Missing persons reports were filed, but without photographs or detailed physical descriptions, the search faced significant obstacles. State Police investigator Captain Roy Hendricks was assigned to the case in late September 1962. His investigation focused on tracing the family's background and determining their connections outside Newton County. What he discovered raised more questions than it answered. According to Hendricks's report, filed with the Arkansas State Police in November 1962, the Vahanian family's history contained significant inconsistencies. Immigration records showed a Casimir Vahanian entering the United States through the port of New Orleans in 1924, but the documentation listed him as a single male, age 35, occupation, scholarly research. No records could be found for Marceline, Aurelius, or Cordelia entering the country at any time. More puzzling was the trail of the family's financial resources. Bank records from the Farmers and Merchants Bank of Jasper showed that Casimir Vahanian had maintained accounts since 1929, but the source of his regular deposits was never clearly established. Mr. Vahanian would appear monthly with cash deposits, testified bank president Arnold Weatherby, always in silver coins, always in amounts that seemed calculated to avoid attention, not large sums, but consistent over many years. Weatherby also noted that Casimir occasionally received wire transfers from banks in other states, particularly Louisiana and Texas. The amounts varied, but they always came from different institutions, he observed, and they were always transferred out again within a few days, usually converted to silver coins. Mr. Vahanian seemed to prefer dealing in silver rather than paper currency. Investigation of the burned materials in the root cellar was hampered by the thoroughness of the destruction, but forensic examination by State Crime Laboratory technicians revealed several disturbing details. Among the ash and debris, investigators found fragments of what appeared to be human bone, though the pieces were too damaged and degraded for positive identification. Dr. Marcus Beaumont, the state medical examiner who examined the bone fragments, noted in his report that the material showed signs of having been subjected to extremely high temperatures for an extended period. The calcification patterns suggest prolonged exposure to heat exceeding 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, he wrote. Such temperatures would normally require specialized equipment or carefully maintained combustion over many hours. Beaumont's analysis also identified metallic residue mixed with the bone fragments that was consistent with medical or scientific instruments. The metal appears to be surgical steel, his report states, possibly from implements designed for precise cutting or extraction procedures, Without more complete samples, definitive identification is impossible. The investigation took an unexpected turn in December 1962 when Sheriff Hayes received a telephone call from Dr. Eugene Blackwell, a psychiatrist formerly affiliated with the Arkansas State Hospital in Little Rock. Dr. Blackwell claimed to have treated members of the Vahanian family during the 1940s and requested a meeting to discuss his observations. According to notes taken by Sheriff Hayes during their meeting, Dr. Blackwell had encountered the Vahanians in 1947 when Aurelius was brought to the state hospital for evaluation following what was described as a nervous breakdown. Dr. Blackwell's treatment records, which he provided to investigators, revealed deeply disturbing details about the family's internal dynamics. The patient exhibited symptoms consistent with prolonged psychological trauma, Dr. Blackwell's notes stated. He displayed extreme anxiety when questioned about family relationships and showed physical evidence of chronic malnourishment, despite claiming adequate food access. Most concerning were his references to requirements that family members were expected to fulfill, though he became extremely agitated when pressed for specific details. Dr. Blackwell's records included transcripts of several sessions with Aurelius, portions of which were deemed relevant to the investigation. In one session, Aurelius reportedly stated, "Casimir says we have obligations that go back generations. He says we're continuing work that was started long before any of us were born, but I don't understand why it has to involve." The transcript breaks off at this point with a notation that the patient became uncommunicative, and the session was terminated. More revealing was Aurelius's description of daily life at the family homestead. According to Dr. Blackwell's notes, patient describes a highly regimented household where all activities are scheduled and monitored. He mentions specific times for meals, work periods, and what he terms observance rituals, though he refuses to elaborate on the nature of these rituals. Patient shows extreme anxiety when discussing the root cellar area of the property, stating that important work is conducted there, but family members are forbidden from speaking about it to outsiders. Dr. Blackwell's treatment of Aurelius lasted only 3 weeks before Casimir Vahanian arrived to remove his relative from the hospital. Casimir's behavior during our meeting was highly unusual, Dr. Blackwell noted. He seemed less concerned with Aurelius's mental health than with ensuring that no details about family activities had been disclosed. He questioned me extensively about the content of our sessions and seemed particularly worried about any mentions of their property or daily routines. The psychiatrist's final note about the encounter was particularly ominous. Mr. Vahanian made it clear that Aurelius would not be returning for further treatment, regardless of his mental state. When I expressed concerns about Aurelius's condition, Casimir stated that family obligations take precedence over individual welfare. He also mentioned that they had commitments that could not be interrupted for medical treatment. I found his attitude toward Aurelius's suffering to be callous and potentially abusive. Investigation into the family's correspondence, particularly the monthly letters from the mysterious K.M. in Little Rock, led state police to a post office box registered to one Konstantin Markovich. Attempts to locate Markovich through Little Rock city directories and phone records were unsuccessful. The post office box had been rented continuously since 1935, always paid for in cash, and no forwarding address was ever provided. Postal Inspector Harold Donning, assigned to investigate the correspondence, discovered that the letters sent to the Vahanian family followed a precise schedule. They were mailed on the 15th of each month without fail for over 20 years, he reported, and they were always identical in size and weight, suggesting standardized contents. The return address showed no telephone contact information, just the post office box number. More intriguing was Donning's discovery that similar letters were being sent to post office boxes in several other states. The same K.M. return address appeared on mail being sent to locations in Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, and Tennessee, he noted. All rural delivery routes, all to recipients who seemed to prefer privacy. When we attempted to investigate further, we found that most of these recipients had also disappeared or become unreachable. The investigation was further complicated by the discovery that the Vahanian property itself had a complex legal history. Title research conducted by state investigators revealed that the land had been owned by a succession of individuals and families, all with similar characteristics. They purchased the property with cash, lived in isolation, and eventually disappeared without explanation. County Clerk Raymond Tate, working with investigators, traced the property's ownership back to 1887. In almost 80 years, that land had been owned by 6 different families, he reported, and in every case, the same pattern emerged. They'd lived there for 20 to 30 years, maintain minimal contact with the outside world, and then vanish, leaving the property to be sold for taxes or transferred to the next owners through mysterious legal arrangements. The previous owners included the Kowalski family, 1887-1912, the Dimitrescu family, 1913-1929, and the Vahanians, 1929-1962. In each case, neighbors reported similar observations. The families kept to themselves, made unusual purchases in town, and seemed to be engaged in activities that they went to great lengths to conceal from outsiders. Mrs. Olive Kowalski, relative of the original Kowalski property owners, was interviewed by investigators in 1963. Though elderly and somewhat confused, she provided insights into the property's earlier history that paralleled the Vahanian family's activities. They were strange people, she recalled about her husband's family, always working on something in that root cellar they built. And the smells that came from there? Mrs. Kowalski struggled to find words. It wasn't like any farming or food preservation I'd ever known. It was sweet and awful at the same time, like flowers rotting in the sun. Mrs. Kowalski also mentioned that her late family member had occasionally spoken about responsibilities that came with owning the property. He'd get correspondence from time to time, she said, and after reading the letters, he'd spend days working in that underground room. He never explained what he was doing, but he'd come back to the house looking sick and exhausted. Said it was work that had to be done, that he'd made promises. The investigation stalled in early 1963 when several key witnesses became reluctant to cooperate further. Some family friends and neighbors who had previously provided detailed statements began claiming they couldn't recall specific details about their interactions with the Vahanians. Others became completely unresponsive to investigators' requests for follow-up interviews. Sheriff Hayes noted this change in cooperation in a report to state authorities. People who were previously eager to help suddenly seemed frightened, he wrote. Mrs. Grady, who provided extensive details about the family's shopping habits, now claims she barely remembers them at all. The mail carrier, Henderson, has requested a route transfer and refuses to discuss the case further. More concerning was the sudden departure of several individuals who had been closely connected to the investigation. Dr. Blackwell, the psychiatrist who had treated Aurelius, abruptly closed his Little Rock practice and left Arkansas without providing a forwarding address. Tax assessor William Moss, whose encounter with the family had helped trigger the investigation, submitted an early retirement application and moved out of state. The final official report on the Vahanian case was filed by Captain Hendricks in July 1963. The document, archived with the Arkansas State Police, concluded that the family had likely fled the state to avoid some form of legal or financial obligation. The case remained technically open, but no further investigative resources were allocated. Hendricks's report acknowledged several unexplained aspects of the case, but offered conventional explanations for most of them. The family's secretive behavior and sudden departure suggest possible involvement in illegal activities, he wrote. The destruction of documents and personal belongings indicates an attempt to eliminate evidence of wrongdoing. While some details remain unclear, the most likely scenario is that the Vahanians were engaged in some form of criminal enterprise that eventually forced them to flee. However, Hendrix's personal notes, discovered years later among his papers after his death in 1974, revealed his true thoughts about the investigation. "There are elements to this case that defy rational explanation," he had written. "The pattern of previous owners, the physical evidence found at the property, and the consistent reports from witnesses suggest something far more disturbing than conventional criminal activity. I believe the Vahanian family was involved in something that goes beyond normal police work, but I lack the evidence or authority to pursue the truth." Interest in the Vahanian case resumed in 1965, when historian Dalton Reeves began documenting Newton County's unusual disappearances as part of a broader study of Arkansas rural history. Reeves had discovered that the Vahanian case was part of a larger pattern of mysterious disappearances throughout the Arkansas Ozarks dating back to the 1880s. What struck me was not just the individual cases, but the connections between them, Reeves noted in his research journal. Families would live in extreme isolation for decades, then disappear completely, leaving behind evidence of activities that neighbors found disturbing but could never quite identify. And in many cases, the properties where these families lived would eventually be occupied by new families exhibiting similar behaviors. Reeves's research revealed that at least 12 families in remote areas of Arkansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma had followed the same pattern over the previous 80 years. All purchased property in cash, lived in isolation, maintained minimal contact with neighbors, and eventually disappeared without explanation. In several cases, investigations found evidence of underground chambers, hidden compartments, and materials suggesting activities that authorities couldn't definitively classify. The most disturbing aspect of the pattern was the apparent coordination between these families, Reeves observed. Mail records, where they could be traced, showed correspondence between the various isolated homesteads. They seemed to be part of some kind of network, possibly coordinating activities or sharing information about their secretive work. Reeves's investigation was cut short in 1966 when he suffered what was described as a nervous breakdown while researching documents related to the case. According to his wife, Helen Reeves, her husband had become increasingly paranoid and obsessive about the project in the weeks before his hospitalization. Dalton started claiming that people were watching our house, she told investigators. He became convinced that his research was putting our family in danger. In his final week of work on the project, he barely slept or ate. He kept saying he'd discovered something about the families that they didn't want exposed, though he never explained who they were. Reeves was treated at the Arkansas State Hospital for 6 months before being released. Upon his return home, he destroyed all of his research materials related to the disappearances and refused to discuss the project. He died in 1967, less than a year after his release, officially of a heart attack, though he was only 43 years old. The Vahanian property remained empty after the family's disappearance. Attempts to sell it through tax auctions were unsuccessful, as potential buyers were deterred by its remote location and the circumstances surrounding the previous owner's disappearance. The buildings gradually fell into disrepair, and the access road became increasingly difficult to navigate as vegetation reclaimed the cleared areas. In 1968, the property was finally purchased by an investment group based in Little Rock. The new owners planned to develop the land for recreational use, possibly as a hunting lodge or retreat center. However, the development plans were abandoned after workers hired to survey and clear the property reported disturbing discoveries. Construction foreman Dale Pettigrew documented several unusual findings in his report to the investment group. The root cellar area had been filled in with concrete some time after the fire, he noted. But when we began excavation for new foundation work, we found that the concrete concealed a much larger underground structure than anyone had realized. Pettigrew's crew discovered that the root cellar was actually the entrance to an extensive underground complex extending deep into the hillside. It wasn't just a storage space, he reported. There were multiple rooms connected by narrow tunnels, all carved out of the natural rock. Some of the chambers were quite large, big enough to accommodate groups of people. More disturbing were the artifacts found within the underground chambers. Pettigrew's inventory included metal tables and equipment that appeared to be designed for medical or scientific procedures, storage containers with residual chemical stains, and wall-mounted brackets that showed evidence of having held restraining devices. The strangest thing was the condition of the walls themselves, Pettigrew noted. In several of the deeper chambers, the rock walls were covered with carved symbols and text in languages none of us could identify. Some of the carvings looked very old, possibly made by previous occupants of the property, but others appeared recent, possibly made by the Vahanian family themselves. Photography of the underground chambers was hampered by poor lighting and structural instability, but several images were captured before the excavation was halted. These photographs, along with Pettigrew's detailed inventory of the site, were submitted to the investment group and subsequently sealed when the development project was canceled. The official reason given for abandoning the development was structural instability of the underground chambers, which posed safety risks for construction workers. However, Pettigrew later told friends that the real reason was the effect the site had on the work crew. Men who had worked construction for 20 years started refusing to enter those underground rooms, he confided to a reporter from the Arkansas Gazette in 1969. They claimed the air down there made them sick, that they heard sounds that couldn't be accounted for by settling earth or wind. Two of my most experienced workers quit rather than continue the excavation. The property was resold in 1969 to the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, which designated it as protected wildlife habitat. This classification effectively prevented further development or investigation of the site. The underground chambers were permanently sealed with concrete, and access to the property was restricted to authorized personnel. Game Warden Joseph Milliken, whose territory included the former Vahanian property, filed several reports about unusual wildlife behavior in the area during the early 1970s. Animals seemed to avoid the immediate vicinity of the old homestead, he noted. Hunting is generally poor in that section of the forest, despite ideal habitat conditions. Even scavenger species like vultures and coyotes seem reluctant to enter the area. Milliken also reported acoustic anomalies that he attributed to wind patterns affected by the underground chamber system. On certain nights, especially when the wind comes from the southeast, you can hear sounds coming from the ground around the old house site, he wrote. It's probably just air moving through the sealed tunnels, but it's unsettling enough that I usually avoid patrolling that area after dark. The final chapter of the Vahanian investigation came in 1969, when retired Postal Inspector Harold Donning received a package at his home address. The package contained no return address and had been mailed from a post office in Memphis, Tennessee. Inside was a collection of documents and photographs related to the mysterious K.M., who had corresponded with the Vahanian family for decades. The materials revealed that Konstantin Markovich had died in 1964, 2 years after the Vahanian family's disappearance. His personal effects, discovered in a storage facility in Memphis, included detailed correspondence with isolated families throughout the Arkansas Ozarks and beyond. The letters revealed that these families were indeed part of a coordinated network, engaged in activities described as preservation of ancient methodologies and continuation of traditional research practices. Most revealing were Markovich's personal journals, which documented his role as a coordinator for what he termed the Preservation Project. According to his entries, families like the Vahanians were responsible for maintaining specific knowledge and performing certain procedures that had been passed down through generations of practitioners. Each family unit maintains one component of the total methodology, Markovich had written. Their isolation ensures protection from interference, while their dedication ensures continuity of the work. The knowledge must be preserved until circumstances permit its broader application. Markovich's journals also contained references to the final phase, which he indicated would begin in the early 1960s. Preparation for consolidation has been successful, he noted in an entry dated 1961. Individual units have completed their development work and are ready for integration. The Arkansas facility has proven particularly successful and will serve as the primary center for the next stage of operations. The journals ended abruptly in December 1962, 3 months after the Vahanian family's disappearance. The final entry read simply, "Arkansas unit has completed transition ahead of schedule. Other units have been notified and are preparing for their own transitions. The work continues, but in a new configuration that offers better protection from outside interference." Postal Inspector Donning forwarded the Markovich materials to the Arkansas State Police, but no additional investigation was initiated. The case files were transferred to the Arkansas State Archives in 1970, where they remained sealed until 1995. When the files were finally opened to researchers, many of the most sensitive documents had been removed or heavily redacted. Local folklore about the Vahanian property persisted long after the official investigation ended. Residents of Newton County continued to report unusual phenomena in the area. Unexplained lights visible from the old homestead site, sounds that seemed to come from underground, and a persistent sense of unease that affected visitors to the location. In 1978, a group of University of Arkansas graduate students studying Ozark folklore attempted to document these stories as part of their research. The students, led by anthropology professor Dr. Sarah Mitchell, planned to spend several days camping near the former Vahanian property to record any unusual occurrences. The camping expedition was terminated after one night when several students reported experiencing what Dr. Mitchell described as significant psychological distress while at the site. Her report to the university administration noted that the students had suffered from severe nightmares, disorientation, and what appeared to be temporary memory loss. The students' accounts were consistent despite being interviewed separately, Dr. Mitchell wrote. They described hearing rhythmic sounds coming from beneath the ground, smelling chemical odors that had no apparent source, and experiencing a sense of being observed by unseen watchers. While these experiences could be attributed to suggestion and psychological factors, the intensity of the students' distress was genuine and concerning. Dr. Mitchell's report recommended that the site be classified as potentially hazardous for research purposes. The university agreed, and no further academic studies of the location were authorized. Dr. Mitchell herself left the University of Arkansas the following year, accepting a position at a college in Oregon where she focused her research on less controversial aspects of folklore. The Vahanian case file was reviewed one final time in 1982 when the Arkansas State Police Cold Case Unit was established. Detective Lieutenant Frank Morrison, assigned to review unsolved disappearances from the 1960s, concluded that the case offered no realistic prospect of resolution given the age of the evidence and the unavailability of key witnesses. The Vahanian family disappearance remains unexplained, Morrison wrote in his summary report, but falls into the category of cases where the likelihood of solving the mystery after 20 years is essentially zero. Without new evidence or witness testimony, further investigation would not be cost-effective. Morrison's private assessment, recorded in his personal notes, was more direct. This case has too many unexplained elements and too many dead ends to pursue through normal investigative methods. Whatever the Vahanian family was involved in, they were part of something larger and more organized than a typical criminal enterprise. The coordinated nature of their disappearance and the destruction of evidence suggests resources and planning beyond what most rural families could manage independently. Today, the former Vahanian property remains part of the Arkansas Wildlife Habitat System. The access road has been permanently closed, and the site is restricted to authorized research personnel studying forest regeneration and wildlife management. The underground chambers remain sealed, and the location of the former buildings is marked only by slight depressions in the forest floor. Hikers and hunters occasionally report finding remnants of the old homestead, fragments of metal buried in leaf litter, pieces of carved stone that may have been part of the original structures, and the occasional discovery of silver coins scattered in areas where the family once lived. Game wardens collect these artifacts when they're reported, but they're generally cataloged and stored without further investigation. The Newton County Historical Society maintains a small file on the Vahanian case, consisting primarily of newspaper clippings and copies of official reports. The file is available to researchers, but interest in the case has waned over the decades. Most residents of the county know the basic story, but few are interested in discussing the details. Former Sheriff Vernon Hayes, now in his 80s and living in a nursing home in Harrison, Arkansas, occasionally receives visits from writers and researchers interested in the case. His memories of the investigation remain sharp, but he's reluctant to speculate about what really happened to the Vahanian family. "I've seen a lot of strange things in 40 years of law enforcement," Hayes said in a 2010 interview, "but that case was different. It wasn't just that the family disappeared. People disappear for all kinds of reasons. It was the feeling that they were part of something bigger, something that we weren't equipped to understand or investigate properly." When asked whether he believed the family's activities were criminal in nature, Hayes paused before responding. "Criminal suggests breaking laws for personal gain," he said, "but what we found at that property suggested something else entirely. It was like they were following a different set of rules, carrying out responsibilities that someone else had defined for them. Whether that was criminal depends on whose authority you recognize." The mystery of the Vahanian family continues to intrigue those who study unexplained disappearances in rural America. Some researchers have connected their case to similar incidents in other isolated regions, suggesting the existence of networks of families engaged in activities that remain hidden from mainstream society. Others propose more conventional explanations, that the family was involved in some form of organized crime, possibly drug manufacturing or distribution, and fled when they feared exposure. The elaborate underground chambers and secretive behavior could be explained by the need to conceal illegal operations from law enforcement. But conventional explanations struggle to account for the historical pattern of similar families occupying the same property over multiple decades, the sophisticated nature of the underground facilities, and the coordinated network of correspondence with isolated families across several states. These elements suggest an operation with resources and planning capabilities that extend far beyond typical criminal enterprises. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Vahanian case is not what was discovered, but what remains unknown. The family lived in apparent isolation for over 30 years, maintaining activities that required significant resources and coordination with outside contacts. Their sudden disappearance was executed with precision that suggests advanced planning and external support. What were they preserving in those underground chambers? What knowledge or procedures were so important that multiple generations of isolated families were willing to sacrifice normal lives to maintain them? And most critically, where did the network go when the Arkansas facility was abandoned? The answers to these questions, if they exist, are buried in archives and memories that may never be accessible to researchers. The Vahanian family has been gone for over 60 years now, long enough that most people who knew them are dead. The physical evidence has been sealed or lost, the documents have been classified or destroyed, and the witnesses have either died or chosen to forget. But sometimes, on quiet evenings in Newton County, residents still report hearing sounds from the direction of the old Vahanian property. Sounds that seem to come from deep underground, rhythmic and purposeful, like the operation of machinery that was built to run for a very long time. The Arkansas Game and Fish Commission attributes these reports to natural acoustic phenomena, wind moving through underground spaces, settling of sealed chambers, the normal sounds of a forest ecosystem. But the reports continue from experienced outdoorsmen who know the difference between natural sounds and something else. And perhaps that's the most unsettling legacy of the Vahanian case, the suggestion that whatever they were doing, whatever they were preserving, might not have ended with their disappearance. The careful planning, the extensive preparations, the coordinated network of similar families, all of it suggests an operation designed to survive the loss of individual participants. The family in the Ozarks pretended to be normal for 33 years. When they stopped pretending in 1962, they vanished so completely that it was as if they had never existed at all. But the echoes of their presence remain, hidden in sealed chambers and classified files, waiting for someone with the right knowledge to understand what they were really doing in those Arkansas hills. Some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed again, and some secrets, once buried, have a way of working their way back to the surface when the time is right.